Thank you all very much for joining our webinar today. We are going to be giving a presentation today on budgeting and compliance and finance for the J. Christopher Stevens Virtual Exchange Initiative's 2023 Virtual Exchange Grant Competition. If you have any questions throughout the presentation or once our presentation concludes, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Some questions we will try to respond to in writing, and other questions we will be answering live during the latter portion of our hour today. We also have a frequently asked questions document that is linked in our call for proposals and is also on our website with a lot of answers to common questions that we get about finance and budgeting, as well as every other component of our competition. So I think we can get started with our presentation today. My name is Andy Schaefer from the Stevens Initiative. You're going to be hearing from me and my colleague Omar during our presentation. And we're also joined by a couple of other colleagues who will be helping to field questions and answer questions, including my colleague Henry Shepard and Greg Spear, and others who are helping to support this. So thank you, team, for being here. Last week, the Stevens Initiative hosted a webinar on the grant competition itself and how to apply. If you missed that webinar and are interested in learning more about it, we are going to be posting a recording of it to the Stevens Initiative's YouTube channel very soon, just as we will be posting a recording of this webinar to our YouTube channel very soon. Today, we are going to be focusing on budgeting, administering a federal award, and compliance. And so we're going to be talking through the federal guidelines that inform both the grants that the Stevens Initiative awards, as well as the budgets that applicants should put together as part of their proposal. And we are also going to talk very briefly as well about monitoring and oversight should an award to your organization be made. And before we kind of jump into the content of our presentation, my colleagues and I are going to go off of video very briefly so that our faces don't interfere with the recording. We are going to come back onto video once we start to field questions later. So goodbye for now. We will be back. We'll be some disembodied voices. I also just wanted to issue one kind of final reminder before we get into today's content that this competition that the Stevens Initiative is offering is intended to fund virtual exchange programs solely between the United States and the Middle East and North Africa. And that also grants are made to organizations because these are large federal grants. We are not giving grants to individuals. I will also maybe just briefly, oh no, okay, Alexa, you had a window in your presentation, but it looks like we're looking good. Okay, let's go to the next slide. For those of you who did not join our webinar last week, a really brief overview on the Stevens Initiative and our work as some level setting. The initiative is a lasting tribute to the late Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens, who served the majority of his diplomatic career building bridges through people-to-people connections in the Middle East and North Africa. And in the ambassador's honor, the Stevens Initiative aims to make international learning experiences available and accessible to as many young people as possible through virtual exchanges. And so we are trying to make virtual exchange more widely available and more widely used because it's such an accessible tool for global education, for international exchange. And one way that we do this is by investing in virtual exchange programs, which is what we're talking about today. The 2023 Virtual Exchange Grant Competition and the J. Christopher Stevens Virtual Exchange Initiative is supported by the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. The Stevens Initiative is housed at the Aspen Institute and administers the J. Christopher Stevens Virtual Exchange Initiative. Again, just as some very brief level setting before we get into our very exciting topic of budgeting, the way that we view virtual exchange for what we're looking to fund in this competition takes a broad view. We think that virtual exchange can look very different, but at its core, it is using sustained tech-enabled communication and collaboration to connect young people in different places, either synchronously in real time and or asynchronously over a period of time. We think that there's a mutual benefit for participants on all sides of the exchange. And we also think that virtual exchange can be integrated into any subject or any topic. It can be integrated in robotics, in art, in social sciences, in business. Virtual exchange has a place in all of it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Omar, who is going to talk about budgeting and compliance. Over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Omar Sawalha. I'm the Finance and Operation Manager at the Stevens Initiative. And we will now talk through the nature of the funding that we are awarding through this competition. The Aspen Institute, where the Stevens Initiative is housed, has a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of State. The Aspen Institute Stevens Initiative passes the government funding on to subrecipients, which are those of you who apply for funding from us. And for the sake of ease, we use the term grantee interchangeably with subrecipient. Those of you who receive a grant from the Stevens Initiative would be subrecipients of the U.S. government funds. Therefore, the federal requirement and regulation governing the Stevens Initiative relationship with the State Department flow to our grantees. The federal regulation that governs our grants are in the U.S. Government Uniform Guidance, 2 CFR 200 and 2 CFR 600. You might want to become familiar with these regulations, which you can find online if you have never seen them before. To talk about this further, we have the U.S. Department of State as the initial funder, which provides funds to the Aspen Institute Stevens Initiative. The Stevens Initiative at the Aspen Institute is responsible for distributing these funds as grants, conducting oversight and monitoring of its grants, providing technical assistance to grantees, and building strong partnership with grantees in an effort to grow the virtual exchange field. Should your proposal be selected for funding, you as the subrecipient or grantee are responsible for implementing the proposed work. We look closely at your internal controls, which include monitoring and oversight, accounting and finance systems, including a general ledger and HR setup. You are responsible to have strong fiscal and program management systems to properly steward federal funds, adhering to the funding requirement per those federal guidelines I mentioned in the previous slide, and ensuring appropriate progress towards performance. Now we will discuss some key points of the Uniform Guidance, which is the code of federal regulation that grantees are required to comply with. For you to keep in mind as you develop your budgets, we strongly encourage you to read through these regulations. The Uniform Guidance provides a U.S. government-wide framework for grants management and federal spending. The guidance applies to nonprofits and institutions of higher education receiving the federal funding to the Stevens Initiative. That Stevens Initiative is rewarding. The Uniform Guidance Cost Principle establishes principles for determining allowable costs in a grant and how funds can be spent. There are some basic concepts that govern all costs of federal subawards or grants. All costs put in your budget must be allowable, necessary, allocable, and reasonable. It's important to ensure that all the costs are reasonable. The idea of determining what is reasonable can be a very subjective process. You should ask yourself if the costs reflect the same action of a rational, sensible, prudent person. Costs must be necessary to conduct the proposed work and should be consistent with your organizational practices. Additionally, costs should be allowable under the regulation we just mentioned or the award provisions. And finally, costs should also be allocable and verifiable, which means they should benefit the project and be easily identified and assigned. Here are some practical questions to ask yourself when you're building your budget. Is this an initial cost? Is the expense related to valid programmatic administrative need? Is this the minimum amount I need to spend to meet my need? Do I have the capacity to use what I'm purchasing? Did I pay a fair price? If I were asked to defend this purchase, would I be able to? Now we will go through unallowable and allowable costs. Unallowable costs include alcohol, entertainment, lobbying costs, cash prices to ensure participation or incentivize youth participation, tuition to pay for youth participants in the virtual exchange program, and advertisement that promotes the organization, although advertising for recruitment is allowable. Allowable costs include salaries for personnel, fringe benefits for staff on the project, stipends for educators and facilitators, development of educational or curriculum materials, software or supplies to support online project work, monitoring and evaluation costs, communication support, including website development, outreach material, marketing, etc. Other direct costs directly related to program activities, like administrative expenses to be a reasonable cost for program administration, technical support, or other administrative needs. If you have any other questions about allowable or unallowable costs, please do read through the regulation, and you are always welcome to reach out to us if you have any more questions. Now we'll go through procurement briefly. Procurement is the process of purchasing goods and services necessary for you to conduct your business and help you achieve the objectives under your subaward. Please reference your organizational procurement policies and practices while you are developing your budget. I want to single here one type of procurement which is a sole source procurement. And a sole source procurement is any contract entered into without a competitive process. Some circumstances that may allow for a sole source include the item or service is only available by one source, or a competition is determined inadequate after a competitive process is administered. Every sole source requires documenting market research and cost analysis efforts. Any sole source require Aspen Institute prior approval. And now we will talk briefly about building your budget as a part of your proposal. A well-developed budget reinforces your credibility as an applicant. Make sure to keep the formulas intact and provide all details within the budget we request. Use historical estimates as a reference for your funding requests. Most importantly, supplement your budget with a well-written budget narrative to support the rationale, purposes, and calculation of costs in the budget. The budget narrative should be able to stand alone and provide enough information to the reader to help them understand the program. So it should be in depth and describe the necessity and reasonableness of costs for conducting work in the proposal. Include contingency plans in your budget narrative and in your proposal designed for any travel or event that may change due to public health consideration or any other reason. Through the next few slides, I will detail some budget categories, including typical costs that fall underneath each category, as well as some items to keep in mind while budgeting for these categories. The first one is personnel. Personnel is for staff working on the proposed budget. We expect to see each staff member listed by title and employee name. In the budget template, you should utilize the annual salary rate, and percentage of time that will be dedicated to the project. We generally do not consider CEO or president costs to be allowable per Aspen Institute policies. And if applicable, these costs should be recouped through indirect costs and should not be listed anywhere on the budget, including the cost share portion. The budget templates also leave room for fringe benefit calculation. What you insert here should be backed up by documented costs or an established formula. We will ask you for fringe benefits backup documentation if you do not include them in your application submission. Costs that fall under participant support might include data plans, travel allowances, training, and resource materials. Most participant support costs should be for youth participants. However, depending on an organization financial policies, educators or other facilitators may qualify as participants in your budget. For an example, if your budget includes stipends to educators, this could fall under the participant support category. Travel. There is a separate travel tab for you to itemize any expense related to project personnel travel, or participant travel. Please be sure to include contingency plans for any travel plans within your budget narrative. Under supplies, you should list supply item by type. No item should be greater than $5,000. Any item listed is typically material that is consumed during the project. Please be as detailed as possible. Rather than writing out technology supplies or classroom supplies, list out each item required for the project and its costs. It's likely that the organization submitting a proposal will work with partners in the United States or in the Middle East and North Africa. Partners is a broad term and may encompass anyone being contracted to develop a curriculum, an to an institution co-designing or co-implementing a program with you. You may include payment to these partners in your budget, whether they are contractors or sub-awardees. For contractors, describe the product or service to be procured by contract and provide an estimate for these costs. Rationalize the rate for this cost in your budget narrative. For sub-awardees, list your implementing partner or partners that will help you carry out part of your federal award. Rationalize the rate for the cost in your budget narrative as well. You may wonder whether a partner in your project would be considered a contractor or a sub-recipient. Please take a look at our frequently asked questions in our website for a full checklist to determine whether a partner would be considered a contractor or a sub-recipient. Generally speaking, contractors provide you with a good or a service, serving as a recruiting arm for your program, designing a curriculum, evaluating your program. These partners normally operate in a competitive environment and are not subject to the same federal compliance requirement as the grantee organization. Subrecipients, however, have a much larger role in the program beyond a simple good or a service. These partners typically provide input into your program design or implementation, and subrecipients are subject to signing an agreement similar to the agreement that you, the grantee, sign with the Stevens Initiative, and are subject to adhering to the same federal guidelines. Other direct costs includes any item that do not fall neatly under the other budget categories. For example, recruiting materials. The budget template includes an indirect cost calculation. Please use your negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, known as NICRA, if you have one. Or you may use the automatic 10% de minimis rate. If you do not have a NICRA, you may only charge up to the de minimis rate. The budget templates also include an automatic 5% reasonable accommodation rate to create space for you to spend on things that help makes your program accessible to participants, namely participants with disabilities and for participants who otherwise would experience significant barriers to participation in the proposed program. If you need to pay to have closed caption added to your webinars, for an example, or you need to make a special accommodation for your participants, this line in your budget is intended to provide you with these resources. Note that the maximum allowable request for budget includes indirect costs and reasonable accommodation costs, meaning if you are applying for a seeding award in which you can request up to $300,000, the entire budget must be $300,000 or less. There is also a section for cost share. This is optional. The cost included under cost share must be verifiable from your records, and it cannot be included as contribution for any other federal awards. So to recap some important items to keep in mind as you prepare to submit your budget. Please be sure to use the provided template available for download on SurveyMonkey Apply. Do not use your own budget templates, please. If there are not enough rows under a certain budget category, feel free to add a row. Leave the formulas intact and follow the instruction listed in tab 1 carefully. Ensure you correctly calculate subawards. An applicant can collect indirect cost on the first $25,000 of each subaward. Adjust the indirect cost calculation depending on if you have a NICRA or not, and be sure to match all dates listed in the budget with the budget narrative, project plan, application, and timeline. All application documents must match the same period of performance. Now we will discuss some items related to monitoring, oversight, and compliance with these awards. I'm going to briefly mention some reporting requirements. Grantees are required to submit progress, financial, and evaluation reports. Generally, this happens quarterly. Stevens Initiative grants are cost reimbursable, which means that grantees submit quarterly financial report to us, reporting on project spending, and we reimburse these costs. Payment is contingent upon receiving and reviewing all reports. Grantees also will be expected to conduct work in accordance with the scope of work, which is essentially all the work that is outlined in your proposal narrative and budget, etc. A few ways to monitor this include site visits, disk reviews, sampling, either of invoices or your partner to check on how work is being conducted, and reviewing the report we mentioned. We are always happy to have an ad hoc calls with our grantees and support whenever we can. In the event of non-compliance, the Stevens Initiative will take the appropriate measures with the grantees. Failure to meet program objectives will result in us working on a corrective action plan, which could include a no-cost extension, suspension, or termination of the award, or the grantee paying funds back to the Stevens Initiative. These are extreme measures, and we hope that this presentation will help you build a sturdy foundation to be compliant if your organization receives a grant. I'm gonna just give everyone a reminder that what you put in your budget and your submission, and if your budget got approved, this budget is approved and it cannot be changed. Any change to any approved budget or proposals need a prior approval and need to be discussed with the Stevens Initiative. And we will see what the possibility of doing any revision to the original approved application. You will see now on the list a screen of different methods to support that we're offering to our applicants. We update the frequently asked questions section of the Stevens Initiative website regularly, so check back for more answers to questions. Lastly, a reminder that applications are due on October 26, 2023. Now we are going to answer your questions live. So if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box on Zoom.
Hi there, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Omar, thank you for an excellent presentation. Andy, thanks for being here as well. I know we have other colleagues supporting us as needed. This is Henry Shepard. I'm an assistant director of the Stevens Initiative, and I'm really pleased to support this webinar by helping facilitate the question and answer. We've had a few questions come in already via the question and answer box in Zoom. So if you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to post them there. We have a few that we haven't answered yet in writing. We might circle back to those that we have answered in writing, and colleagues have shared some additional questions with me that we can speak to out loud as well. So please don't hesitate to post your questions in the question and answer box. I want to start with something that we were asked a few minutes ago. This is from Travis, and Travis asks, did I understand correctly that if we have other government funding going towards our program, for example, from a US embassy, should we not include it in the cost share budget? So maybe you can speak a little bit more to what should and shouldn't be included in cost share, and also this related question of, if an organization has other funding from a source like a different part of the State Department or any other federal entity, how should that be considered, and what are some key considerations that an organization should keep in mind? So cost share, but also the involvement of other funders, particularly other government funders.
So cost share, when you commit to cost share in your budget, you're expected to actually spend that commitment, that cost share, into, for an example, if we in our budget, into our program. Therefore, this money should not be related to anywhere. So I'm just gonna point out two different situations that you mentioned, Henry. The first, you cannot use federal money that you got from another source on our budgets. With basically, you're taking federal money from somewhere and committed them to another federal budget. It doesn't, please don't do that. This is not allowable. And because, you know, when you do the budget for each of these programs, all these costs that include in these budgets are to conduct the project and the activities under these programs of each budget. So you cannot move funds this way. Other than that, if you have money from your own company that you want to commit to cost share, let's say you have 50,000 that you can commit. You committed 30 to us. You cannot commit anything from this 30 somewhere else, because you are expected to spend the full amount of $30,000 to conduct the activities under our program.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very, very helpful. Thank you. And I know that whoever asked the question or has further questions related to that topic will certainly be able to type further into the Q&A box to ask more. This question may be best for you, Andy, and it comes from an anonymous attendee. The question is, or it has a little bit of a setup, so I'll just read it all out loud. The project total amount is divided by the number of participants to calculate the allowable cost per participant. Considering the Stevens Initiative's definition of meaningful participation, which is that an individual who completes 75% of the synchronous and asynchronous exchange activities is considered to have meaningfully participated in the program, the total amount should be divided by 75% of the total participants. I think this gets really tricky with the math, and maybe the person asking the question might have conflated things a little bit. But what would you encourage people to do regarding this question of, first of all, can you just affirm what the person asking the question is saying about what we want them to do for that cost per participant calculation, and how would you encourage people to think about the way that participants don't always complete the program, and what we are really going to use during the grant as a basis for determining whether an organization has met their participant reach obligations?
Yeah, I think I understand what we're getting at here. Thank you for this question. I will just also briefly back up and mention that for those of you who were not able to join our call last week, just really briefly, we are offering 3 different types of grants that are different sizes of kind of a maximum allowable amount of funding. Each grant type is associated with an allowable maximum cost per participant, with the thought that larger grants are for larger programs that should be operating at a slightly more efficient scale. So they have a lower allowable cost per participant than newer programs that may have, higher startup costs or higher fixed costs. The way that an applicant should calculate their cost per participant is by dividing their budget, inclusive of indirect costs, inclusive of reasonable accommodation costs, by the intended number of participants. you would not count cost share in this calculation. So just kind of your full budget divided by the intended number of participants. As far as the 75% goes, you should calculate your cost per participant based on 100% of the participants that you intend to reach. I will also say that we are expecting that you as a grantee will reach 100% of the participants that you have listed in your application. So we will be holding you to what you say you can feasibly reach. We know that there is natural attrition. We know that not all participants, may necessarily complete the program. So you, as the practitioner, should plan for this in your plans. You should have strong recruiting plans, and you might want to consider over recruiting into your program to account for some natural attrition. You might also want to consider retention strategies and incentives for participants to join and ultimately complete the program. You might also want to think about this in the context of how you set up your facilitation structure so that you ensure that you're kind of scaffolding support for your participants so that they stay in the program. And with that 75%, that applies more, think of it more as applying to an individual rather than your pool of participants, because say you're talking about a program that's embedded into a high school classroom. Not everyone's going to come to school 100% of the days, and that's okay. They can still be counted as a participant, even if they don't do 100% of the virtual exchange activities.
Thank you very much, Andy.
Helpful.
Very helpful. I want to talk next about who should apply for which type of grant or award. So maybe I'll start with you, Omar, and Andy can add on to this if there's anything that needs to be added. The question we have from Noor is, if I have previous experience with virtual exchange in my classroom, but it was not supported by a previous grant, would I still need to apply for a seeding grant? So maybe at the root of the question, Omar, it is, are there any strict eligibility or requirements or expectations for who can apply for which grant type? And beyond that, do we have any guidance or encouragement for which grant type an organization should consider applying for?
There are multiple factors of what type of grant you can apply to. I think, first of all, do you have previous experience? Second of all, if we also could look at your operational expenses, and if actually financially you are able to do the work or conduct the work based on your operation under this the funding, the type of funding that you're requesting. And also we look into the funding not to be more than 40% of your physical operational expenses. If Andy can add more to that.
Sure. I can speak about it a little bit from a programmatic perspective. Also, I will maybe just say, Omar, too, we have listed actually an applicant can request no more than 80% of the previous year's fiscal operating budget. And I understand why you said 40%, because it's like 40% per year. We have 2-year grants. So essentially, we don't want our grants to comprise more than 40% of an organization's operating budget in any given year. Does that sound right? From a programmatic perspective, we are open to, an organization deciding what type of grant to apply for and what is going to best suit their needs. Like Omar said, their capacity and operating budget, and where their program is, where they're kind of operating, if they're operating on a more kind of efficient scale or if they're a newer program. We are leaving it to an applicant to determine. For the larger grants, we will want to know, what an applicant organization's experience has been implementing virtual exchange, so that, the assumption is that these programs are building on past experience. I don't say that to be prescriptive. I just say that to give an idea. And ultimately, an organization should decide what works best in terms of the grant size to apply for.
Thank you both. We have a question about some costs that I want to pose to you. Would giving participants transportation costs or internet stipends be a form of incentive or ways to retain students, for example, students coming from refugee backgrounds? Would this be acceptable to include in the budget? So is it acceptable to include like local transportation costs or internet access stipends or other related supplies or services? And is that in some way an incentive or a way to retain students in the program? So is it acceptable? And then how do you kind of think about that?
Yes, it is acceptable in these two specific examples, but to think about it in a general way, if any costs that would be necessary for actually the participant to be able to successfully participate, that will be allowable. And also we mentioned in the slides that we added the 5% reasonable accommodation for people that usually do not get the chances because things like that, they don't have internet or they cannot move easily from refugee camps. So also these can be utilized for expenses like this. If you basically offering kind of prizes or things that actually not necessary for conducting the program, then that will be incentivizing the participation. But any costs that is required for participant to successfully participate in the program, it would be an allowable cost.
Sorry, I was just typing an answer to a question. Thank you very much. Okay. We have a question about contracts and subrecipients or subgrants. The question is, can you give a little more guidance on if a partner, on which category a partner should be described? For example, a quote, global partner, would this be a contractor or a subrecipient? So maybe you can speak a little bit to the difference between a contract or a subgrant, and what are some sort of rules or guidelines that an organization can use when they're trying to determine which of these to list for any particular organization or company they're planning on working with to conduct their program?
The easiest way to think about it is a contract is someone actually doing regular business of providing goods or services that I would need these goods and services in a way of conducting my program successfully. So these people would do the regular business of providing these services for you to be able to provide to conduct the program. A subrecipient would be someone actually participating with you in doing some of the work under your program. So they're actively either designing the program with you or doing actually, so basically you're putting some of the work and flowing it down under this program to do. That's a subrecipient. A contractor is someone who's doing regular business, and you want that regular service, providing regular service or goods, and you want these goods or services to be able to successfully conduct your program. That's the main difference between them. It's not about what the type of partner it is about what actually they're providing you with.
I will also just say that there's a nice little checklist with everything that Omar just outlined in our frequently asked questions document, which is linked in the call for proposals and on our website. And I think maybe one of our colleagues might be able to link to that in the chat for you all to see as well. Kind of outlines everything that Omar just went through to help you make your decision about how you want to categorize a partner.
Thank you both very much. I want to really briefly cover a nice technical question. Can a budget item be for purchasing equipment, such as a large monitor for a classroom, or a projector, or computers, or Wi-Fi equipment? So what's the distinction maybe between equipment and supplies, and what kinds of factors would you encourage people to have in mind regarding the purchase of larger or more expensive equipment?
In a generally speaking, any unit price of $5,000 or more, that's equipment. That means that also that equipment you need to apply from a financial point of perspective depreciation on. So these are basically anything over 5,000, it will consider equipment dash assets. Now, what supplies are? Supplies sometimes can be like monitors, but first of all, it should be less, the unit price should be less than $5,000. And secondly, it need to be very necessary for you to be able to conduct this program. And that's basically from a money point of view, there's a difference. And then from like a financial perspective, because we're not funding, in a way, we're not funding your organization to be able to build assets like equipment with more than $5,000. We actually want to make you be able to request supplies that mostly will be either depreciated or spent or used during the period of performance of our program.
Thank you very much, Omar. I have two interrelated questions here, and maybe I'll start off by posing it to Andy, and Omar, certainly welcome your thoughts as well. They both relate to travel. One of the questions is rather long, and I'll summarize it by saying that the questioner says that there is value to in-person components of virtual exchange programs, which we certainly agree with, whether that's for youth participants or for educators or other facilitators who will be supporting the program. So the first general question is, do we have any guidance about the proportion of a grant that should be allocated toward travel? And another question is travel for finding or engaging with partners, schools, participants, is that something that we are open to seeing as part of a proposal? So what portion of a budget should be related to in-person travel? And is travel not just for the exchange activities, but also for the work to form partnerships and support the project, is that allowable?
Sure. I can briefly answer that second question first, which is yes, it is allowable to put on your budget travel for things like partnership building, recruiting, meeting with partners to refine your program at some point, maybe conducting a site visit of some of your partner sites. Those are all allowable costs for staff, for example, to participate in. Regarding the first question with in-person travel, yes, in-person travel, like you say, Henry, is allowable. I will also broadly say that all travel, whether that is participant or facilitator or staff travel, well in advance of it actually happening, needs to be approved both by the Stevens Initiative as well as the Department of State. So it's a little bit of a lengthy process. So it requires a lot of advanced planning and organization in order to happen successfully. In terms of the proportion of a budget that goes to in-person travel versus not, I don't have an actual percentage to give to you, but what I will say is that the overwhelming majority of the budget should be dedicated to virtual exchange activities. That is the majority of what we are looking to fund. And indeed, in-person travel can be a nice complement. We know that it can also be a nice incentive for young people to participate if, say a select number of participants have the opportunity to win the opportunity to travel or be selected for the opportunity to travel. So we know that that has a cost associated with it. It should just be very clear that the overwhelming majority of expenses and time and effort on this project are going toward virtual exchange. I know that this is also a little bit in the weeds, but I did see this question in writing and I saw that there was a note of visa costs. Visa costs would be covered by the Department of State, so you do not need to budget for visa costs for participants coming to the United States from abroad. If participants are going from the United States to a country abroad, then yes, you can budget for in-country visas in your budget if that is applicable. Omar, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just remind everyone, based on what you said, Andy, that all the in-person travel need to be, we need to get prior approval from Department of State. So please make sure to be as detailed as possible of explaining your cost calculations, and also adding the like a really good justification for the travel in your budget narratives.
Andy, I have one more question for you, and then I think I will turn to Omar for the last few questions. The question is an organization able to work with refugees, such as Syrian refugees, in Turkey or Jordan, or do they need to be living directly in Syria? So can you talk a little bit about how we think about refugees and what guidance the Department of State has given us at this point regarding participants who are located somewhere other than the Middle East and North Africa as defined by the Department of State?
Yeah, we are certainly open to programs that are reaching refugee populations that are located within the Middle East and North Africa as the Department of State defines it. So that is the Bureau of Near East Affairs at the State Department, the definition that they use. They do not include Turkey in that definition. And we are kind of charged with just reaching participants who are located in that Near East Affairs defined Middle East and North Africa region. So essentially, to answer this question, absolutely, if there are refugees from Syria or anywhere else located in Jordan, since Jordan falls under that category, that's great, that is allowable. unfortunately, we cannot have participants or partners who are maybe from the Near East Affairs region who are located outside that region. So unfortunately, not in Turkey or Canada or the UK or anywhere else that falls outside of that Near East Affairs defined Middle East, North Africa region.
The one remaining question, the last question, will be for Omar for a very brief answer if possible, and then I invite you to close us out. Thank you all so much for being here today. The question is, or two somewhat related questions. Is cost share required? And then second question, we talk about cost per participant, but we also have something in our budget, a section called participant support. So is there any relationship between participant support and cost per participant, or are these two unrelated concepts? So cost share, is it required? And what do we mean by participant support, and how does that relate to cost per participant?
Cost share is not required. Cost share is optional. View cost share in a way like this. We have, for an example, the seeding grants are maximum of $300,000. If you put a really nice program, and then you got a little bit more than $300,000, and you think everything that you put there is necessary for the program, and you can add a part of cost share on it to be within the limit, then that's when basically you can book cost share. But cost share is optional and is not required. Participant support costs has nothing to do with cost per participant, because cost per participant is a different calculation, is the total budget and the number of participants that you're gonna serve in this program. Cost per participant support cost is only to a budget category where you put the cost that directly goes to benefit subrecipients. I hope that answers.
Thank you.
Okay, and if there is no more questions, thank you everyone for joining us today. I want to just give you a reminder that make sure to follow us on X, previously Twitter, Stevens INIT, and follow us on Facebook as Stevens Initiative, and in LinkedIn at the Stevens Initiative at the Aspen Institute for updates about the initiative. And also a second reminder about the applications are due on October 26th, 2023.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.